In February 2008, the body of 28-year-old Sarah Keating was discovered in her apartment in Chicago, Illinois, a scene of unimaginable violence that left investigators shocked. What began as the brutal murder of a brilliant young surgical assistant would soon unravel into a scandal that shook the medical community to its core. The investigation uncovered a tangled web of lies, betrayal, and ambition surrounding Sarah's relationship with her boss, renowned cardiothoracic surgeon Dr. Alan Whitmore. In April 2009, within the pristine halls of Beacon Medical Center, a secret affair began that would set off a chain of events, ultimately leading to Sarah's tragic death. Sarah had been strangled, the surgical tubing wrapped tightly around her neck, leaving deep marks on her skin. Blood pooled around her from multiple stab wounds, and the apartment bore evidence of a fight for her life. Broken glass littered the floor, furniture was upturned, and scattered belongings told the story of a confrontation that had spiraled out of control. For those who would later walk through the scene, the violence felt personal, as though the assailant had acted out of raw, uncontrollable emotion. The following morning, on the 16th of November, the smell of iron lingered faintly in the hallway outside Sarah's apartment. It was her neighbor, a retiree who lived alone, who noticed something was amiss. The night before, she had heard muffled shouting, an argument perhaps, and the sound of glass shattering. It wasn't unusual for Sarah to have visitors, and so the neighbor hesitated. But when the morning came and she saw Sarah's apartment door slightly ajar, an eerie sense of dread compelled her to investigate. As she approached, she noticed a dark red smear on the doorframe. Her hand trembled as she pushed the door open, and her eyes were met with a scene she would never forget. Sarah's lifeless form was sprawled across the living room floor, and the silence in the apartment was deafening. Panicked, the neighbor stumbled back into the hallway and called 911. The words spilled out of her in a shaky, horrified voice, drawing the attention of others in the building, who began to gather in hushed whispers. When the police arrived, their immediate assessment of the scene confirmed that this was no random act of violence. The precision and intent in the crime suggested that the killer knew Sarah. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong, nor was it a crime of opportunity. It was something much darker, something fueled by emotion. Detectives from the Chicago Police Department quickly took charge of the investigation. Among them was Detective Raymond Carter, a seasoned investigator with years of experience handling violent crimes. Carter was known for his calm demeanor and methodical approach, but even he felt a pang of unease as he examined the scene. He noted the overturned coffee table, the broken picture frame near Sarah's body, and the distinctively medical nature of the murder weapon, a surgical tool. Everything about the scene spoke of anger, but it also spoke of familiarity. Whoever had done this had known Sarah well enough to be in her apartment that night. As the detectives began to piece together the events, they worked quickly to identify anyone who might have had a motive. Sarah's work life was the first avenue they explored. A brilliant and diligent assistant, she worked closely with some of the most prominent surgeons in the city, including Dr. Alan Whitmore. His name came up almost immediately, as he had been Sarah's supervising surgeon for years and was known for his perfectionism and high expectations. The two had been seen together frequently, often working late hours at the hospital. To outsiders, their relationship appeared strictly professional, but rumors in the hospital hinted at a bond that went beyond the operating room. The investigation took a critical turn when detectives gained access to Sarah's phone records. They discovered that she and Dr. Whitmore had exchanged text messages on the night of her death. The tone of the messages suggested a heated argument, with Sarah insisting on meeting him in person. Dr. Whitmore claimed that their conversation had been about a complex patient case, but the nature of their messages suggested otherwise. Detectives couldn't ignore the possibility that this argument had led to the tragic events that followed. By the 18th of November, suspicions around Dr. Whitmore had grown significantly. Detectives paid him a visit at his sprawling suburban home, where he lived with his wife, Vivian. Alan greeted them with the poise and charm for which he was known, but there was a tension behind his eyes that he couldn't quite mask. He repeated his story. He had been home with Vivian on the night of Sarah's murder, reviewing medical notes and preparing for an upcoming surgery. But something about his calm felt rehearsed, like a surgeon masking his nerves before stepping into the operating room. The detectives noticed small cracks in his story. For one, there were no signs that he had logged into the hospital's system that night, which would have been routine for reviewing patient charts. Secondly, his wife's account of the evening seemed strangely detached, as though she was saying what she thought she should, rather than what she remembered. These inconsistencies only deepened the detective's suspicion that Dr. Whitmore was hiding something. Their suspicions were confirmed on the 25th of November when forensic results came back. Among the evidence collected at Sarah's apartment was a partial fingerprint on the surgical tubing used to strangle her. The fingerprint was a match for Dr. Whitmore. The discovery was damning, but it wasn't the only piece of evidence that pointed to his involvement. Witnesses at the hospital came forward, recalling tense arguments between Alan and Sarah in the weeks leading up to her death. It became clear that their relationship had soured, though the reasons for this remained unclear. By now, the case against Dr. Whitmore was building rapidly. The meticulous reputation that had once made him untouchable in the medical world was unraveling under the weight of the investigation. For detectives, it wasn't just about the evidence. It was about the story that was beginning to emerge. A story of ambition, betrayal, and the devastating lengths someone would go to in order to protect their secrets. On the 10th of December, Dr. Whitmore was formally arrested. The trial that would follow promised to uncover not just the truth about Sarah's murder, but the deeper, darker truths that lay beneath the polished surface of a man celebrated for saving lives. As the world looked on, the question lingered. How had Dr. Alan Whitmore, a surgeon with the power to heal, become the architect of such destruction? Dr. Alan Whitmore had spent decades building a career that most could only dream of. By the age of 45, he was not only one of the most respected cardiothoracic surgeons in the country, but also the face of Beacon Medical Center, a prestigious hospital in Chicago. His surgical skill and charm made him a public favorite, often featured in medical journals and on news segments highlighting groundbreaking procedures. Patients adored him, his colleagues envied him, and his reputation was, by all accounts, flawless. But Alan's life outside the hospital walls was far from perfect. He was married to Vivian Whitmore, a high-profile criminal defense attorney. Together they appeared to be the ultimate power couple, a successful surgeon and an elite lawyer navigating Chicago's competitive professional landscape. However, behind the perfectly curated image, their marriage was crumbling. Vivian, though brilliant and devoted to her career, had grown emotionally distant. Her focus on her work often left little room for intimacy or connection, and over the years, Alan had felt more like a stranger in his own home. It was in this void that Sarah Keating entered his life. Sarah, 28, was Alan's trusted surgical assistant, someone he had worked closely with for 5 years. She was young, ambitious, and fiercely intelligent. Alan admired her attention to detail and her ability to anticipate his needs in the operating room. She was the kind of assistant who made his job easier, someone who matched his energy and drive. But their relationship, initially professional, started to shift after countless late nights at the hospital. By April 2009, What had begun as subtle flirtation turned into something far more serious. Alan and Sarah embarked on an affair that quickly consumed them both. For Sarah, it was more than just an affair. It was love. Alan had a magnetic presence, and she believed the promises he whispered when they were alone. He told her he was unhappy in his marriage, that Vivian didn't understand him anymore, and that he was planning to leave. Sarah, blinded by her feelings, saw herself as his escape, the one who could bring him happiness again. Unbeknownst to Alan, Sarah began documenting their relationship. She kept everything: photos of their intimate moments, love letters he had written her, and explicit text messages they exchanged. For Sarah, these were keepsakes of a love she thought was destined to last. For Alan, they were dangerous liabilities, though he didn't yet know they existed. By July 2009, Vivian's suspicions about Alan's fidelity had reached a breaking point. She had noticed the late nights at the hospital, the unexplained absences, and the emotional distance that had grown between them. As a seasoned attorney, Vivian was no stranger to uncovering secrets. Without confronting Alan directly, she quietly hired a private investigator to gather evidence of his infidelity. Though Alan was unaware of her actions, he began to sense that something wasn't right. Vivian's demeanor had changed. Her questions felt sharper, her glances lingered a bit too long, and Alan began to fear that his carefully constructed life was unraveling. At the same time, his relationship with Sarah grew more complicated. In September 2009, Sarah revealed something that would change everything. She was pregnant. For Sarah, the pregnancy was both a shock and a source of hope. She believed this would finally push Alan to leave Vivian and start a life with her. But Alan's reaction was far from what she expected. Instead of excitement, he responded with coldness and panic. He insisted that the pregnancy was impossible to keep, that it would ruin his career and destroy his reputation. He demanded she terminate it, leaving Sarah heartbroken and feeling more alone than ever. As the weeks went by, the dynamic between them shifted further. Alan became increasingly distant, avoiding Sarah whenever he could and focusing on his work. Sarah, however, refused to be dismissed. She had given years of her life to Alan and sacrificed her reputation by being involved with a married man. She wasn't going to let him walk away so easily. By October 2009, Sarah's frustration reached a boiling point. She began threatening to expose the affair, telling Alan that if he didn't leave Vivian, she would take everything she had: photos, messages, and evidence of their relationship, and go public. Alan, terrified of the fallout, tried to calm her, but his efforts only seemed to fuel her anger. Sarah sent him an email attaching some of the evidence she had collected. It was her ultimatum: either he left Vivian or she would leak everything to the media. When Alan saw the email, his heart sank. He deleted it immediately, but the paranoia began to eat away at him. The thought of losing everything he had worked for, his career, his marriage, and his reputation, was unbearable. He began to spiral, consumed by fear and resentment. By the 14th of November 2009, Alan felt like a man on the edge. That evening, he made the decision to confront Sarah in person. He told Vivian he was going to the hospital to check on a patient, a lie she didn't question. Driving to Sarah's apartment, his mind raced with thoughts of how to convince her to stay silent. He still believed he could control the situation, that he could talk her down and salvage what was left of his life. When Alan arrived at Sarah's apartment, the tension between them was palpable. The conversation started quietly, but it quickly escalated. Sarah accused him of using her, of stringing her along with empty promises, while never intending to leave his wife. She reminded him of everything she had sacrificed for him and made it clear that she was done being ignored. She threatened to leak the evidence she had to the press, a threat that pushed Alan into a corner. He begged her to reconsider, but Sarah, fed up and angry, refused to back down. The argument became heated, voices rising and emotions boiling over. At some point, Alan's desperation turned into rage. In a moment of blind fury, he grabbed a piece of surgical tubing that was lying on Sarah's coffee table, one of the many tools she often used for her work. Before he fully realized what he was doing, he wrapped it around her neck and pulled tight. Sarah fought back, clawing at his hands and trying to free herself, but Alan's grip was unrelenting. When she stopped struggling, Alan froze, staring at what he had done. The room was silent, except for the sound of his own ragged breathing. Panic set in, and in his mind there was only one way to ensure she couldn't expose him. He grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and stabbed her multiple times, the act more about his fear than any calculated decision. As Alan stood over her lifeless body, the weight of his actions began to sink in. The man who had spent his life saving others had just taken a life in a moment of uncontrollable rage and desperation. Everything he had feared, losing his career, his marriage, his reputation, was now inevitable. Only now it wasn't Sarah's threats that endangered him. It was the blood on his hands. The trial of Dr. Alan Whitmore was one of the most talked about legal battles of the decade. By the time the proceedings began in early January 2010, the once revered surgeon had already fallen from grace in the eyes of the public. What had started as an investigation into the murder of his assistant, Sarah Keating, had evolved into a much darker and more complicated story. It was no longer just about an affair gone wrong or a crime of passion. It was about a web of lies, a lifetime of deception unraveled with a single, shocking secret that Alan Whitmore had fought desperately to keep buried. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Alan maintained his innocence with calculated precision. He insisted that Sarah's death was nothing more than a tragic coincidence, claiming that he had not been at her apartment on the night of November 14, 2009. His wife, Vivian Whitmore, a renowned criminal defense attorney with an impressive record of courtroom victories, initially stood by him. To outsiders, Vivian's loyalty seemed resolute, a testament to the unshakable bond between husband and wife. But behind closed doors, Vivian's confidence in Alan was beginning to erode. As the trial began, the prosecution wasted no time presenting their case. The evidence against Alan was damning. Forensic analysis revealed a partial fingerprint on the surgical tubing used to strangle Sarah, directly linking Alan to the crime scene. Neighbors testified to hearing muffled shouting on the night of Sarah's murder, placing Alan near her apartment at a critical time. But the most incriminating piece of evidence came in the form of a detailed timeline reconstructed from text messages and call logs, showing that Alan had been in communication with Sarah just hours before her death. The narrative painted by the prosecution was clear. Alan had motive, opportunity, and the means to commit the murder. As the trial unfolded, the courtroom became a stage for mounting tension and dramatic revelations. The first major crack in Alan's defense appeared not through the prosecution's case, but in an unexpected discovery by Vivian herself. While meticulously reviewing the evidence as part of her preparation for the defense, Vivian stumbled upon something that would change everything. Among Sarah's files collected by investigators, Vivian found records tied to Alan's surgical practice. Initially, the documents seemed routine, a collection of performance metrics and patient outcomes. But the deeper Vivian dug, the more troubling the inconsistencies became. The success rates Alan had touted throughout his career, results that had earned him accolades, a sterling reputation, and the title of the face of Beacon Medical Center, were too perfect. Patient records didn't align with the glowing statistics featured in Alan's public profiles. Vivian's meticulous legal mind couldn't overlook the discrepancies, and as she pieced together the information, a horrifying truth began to emerge. Alan had been falsifying his surgical success rates for years. Patients who had suffered complications or even died under his care were misrepresented as successes, their records altered to preserve the illusion of his unparalleled skill. Vivian realized that Alan's career, his accolades, and the prestige he had built were all based on a web of lies. This wasn't a single misstep. It was a systematic effort to fabricate his legacy at the expense of truth and human lives. But the revelations didn't end there. Sarah, as Alan's trusted assistant, had been the only person with access to the unaltered data. Over the years, she had seen the truth behind the facade. Initially, Sarah might have kept silent out of loyalty or fear, but as her relationship with Alan grew strained, her priorities shifted. Sarah had begun documenting everything: the altered records, the real statistics, and the names of patients whose outcomes had been manipulated. She had created a detailed, damning archive that could expose Alan's fraudulent career. The discovery of these records shattered Vivian's already fragile faith in her husband. She realized that Sarah's murder wasn't just a crime of passion or a desperate act of rage. It was a calculated move to silence the one person who had the power to destroy him. The evidence Sarah had collected wasn't just a motive, it was the key to unraveling the full extent of Alan's deception. As Vivian grappled with the weight of these revelations, she faced an impossible choice. She could continue to defend Alan, risking her integrity and professional reputation, or she could step back and allow the truth to come to light. Either way, the case had become far more than just a murder trial. It was a reckoning, not just for Alan, but for everyone who had been drawn into his orbit of lies and betrayal. By the time of her death, Sarah had accumulated a treasure trove of information that could have destroyed Alan's career. Vivian realized that this secret, more than the affair, was the true motive behind Sarah's murder. Alan hadn't just killed to protect his reputation, he had killed to hide the truth about the lives he had ruined. Vivian's discovery put her in an impossible position. As Alan's defense attorney, her job was to protect him, but as his wife, she couldn't ignore the gravity of his betrayal. For years, she had believed in the man she married even when their relationship had grown distant. Now, she saw him for what he truly was: a man willing to sacrifice anyone, even someone who had trusted and loved him, to protect his image. The case took another dramatic turn in mid-February 2010, when a new piece of evidence came to light. Melissa Harper, one of Sarah's closest friends, had been helping Sarah move into her new apartment a few weeks before her death. While sorting through Sarah's belongings, Melissa had come across a small USB drive that Sarah had tucked away in a jewelry box. At the time, Melissa hadn't thought much of it, but after Sarah's murder, she remembered the drive and handed it over to the police. The contents of the USB drive were devastating for Alan's defense. It contained explicit evidence of the affair, photos, messages, and videos that left no room for doubt. More importantly, it included the documentation of Alan's falsified surgical records. Sarah had been meticulous in her record-keeping, creating spreadsheets and timelines that detailed every instance of malpractice. For the prosecution, it was the smoking gun they needed to solidify their case. Vivian, now fully aware of the extent of Alan's deceit, faced a moral dilemma. On one hand, she had a professional duty to defend her client to the best of her ability. On the other hand, she couldn't ignore the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. Over the course of the trial, Vivian began to subtly sabotage Alan's defense. She allowed certain pieces of evidence to be admitted without objection And during cross-examinations, her questions often highlighted Alan's inconsistencies rather than defending him. To outsiders, it appeared as though she was simply struggling to mount a strong defense against such damning evidence, but those who knew her suspected it was something more deliberate. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak on March 3, 2010, when the jury returned with their verdict. After weeks of testimony and hours of deliberation, Alan was found guilty of second-degree murder. The verdict was a devastating blow for him, but for Sarah's family and friends, it was a moment of bittersweet relief. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring Sarah back. In the aftermath of the trial, Vivian wasted no time distancing herself from Alan. She filed for divorce and began writing a memoir detailing her perspective on the case and the man she had thought she knew. The memoir, published a year later, painted a damning portrait of Alan and further tarnished his legacy. In it, Vivian described the emotional toll of the trial, her discovery of Alan's lies, and her decision to let him face the consequences of his actions. For the medical community, Alan's downfall was a wake-up call. Investigations into his falsified records led to sweeping changes at Beacon Medical Center and sparked a broader conversation about accountability and ethics in the field. Alan's name, once synonymous with excellence, became a cautionary tale. Sarah Keating's death, though tragic, became the catalyst for exposing a legacy of deception. Her courage in documenting the truth, even at great personal risk, ensured that Alan's crimes would not go unnoticed. Years later, her story continues to be remembered as a chilling reminder of how ambition, betrayal, and unchecked power can destroy lives. Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our daily updates, and check out another insane case we have covered, the case where a top black basketball player murders a cheerleader to hide a secret affair. Be sure to check it out and let us know your thoughts in the comment section.